I had come from Messina, New York, to attend the University of Minnesota in the fall of 1941. And I finished my freshman year and came back in the fall of 42 and needed some money. So I got a job I had a job at University of Minnesota Kaufman Union Student Food Services. And Carola, at the same time, had transferred from Mankato State University to the University of Minnesota. And she had a job in the student cafeteria serving primarily desserts, and particularly cherry pie, which became a lifetime favorite of mine. And we dated quite a few times until about February of 1943, when I went into the U.S. Air Force and started a travel routine around the country, different spots. And over time, Carola and I just drifted apart, just kind of, might say, just terminated a relationship gradually. Well, then I went to the various training spots, and I didn't know what had happened to Carola. But I graduated from flight training in San Antonio in the April or May of 1944, and had a couple of assignments. First as an instructor, that status changed, and I ended up as a copilot trainee on B-24s and was assigned to Mountain Home, Idaho, which was like 30 or 35 miles from Boise. And the first weekend off, I went into Boise on the bus and decided, well, there's nothing really to do in Boise, so I'll stick around the base on the weekends. But one day, after a week or two there, I came down for a training flight with one of the guys in the crew, and we stopped at the post office, picked up the mail, and didn't I have a letter from C. Lunan of Easton, Minnesota. I had no idea she was there, nor did she have any idea where I was. But apparently she had some fella from Minnesota who had been at the university, and maybe it was lucky for Carola, I don't know. But anyway, it was lucky for me that she was going to San Francisco to visit a friend of hers from Easton, but she happened to go by way of Boise, Idaho. And this guy, to the best I was able to put this story together, this guy was at a Air Force training base at Boise, and Carola had enough interest that she took a detour to Boise on her way to San Francisco. And when she mailed her letter, it was from Minneapolis, And I got that letter had gone to my most previous base assignments at Brooksfield and San Antonio, Texas. Then I was training in, to be an instructor of flight students at Frederick, Oklahoma. And then, let's see, when we were at Mountain Home, Idaho, I went into town that one weekend that I talked about. Then I was going to stay on the base on the succeeding weekends. But when I got that letter, I couldn't believe it, because I had a picture that I had with me all the time that I had been missing Carola, but we had just never corresponded. So our flight engineer and I picked up our mail, and here was this letter from C. Lunan in Boise, 3415 and a half Thatcher Street in Boise, Idaho. So that evening I went through the Boise phone book, and I found 415 and 416, but not 415 and a half Thatcher Street. So the next day I called one of those addresses and talked to the lady who had a rooming house. And she said, "Who was I looking for?" And I said, Carola Lunan. She said, "You want to speak to her?" And those were really understated words, because here I had seen her since the spring of '43. So anyway, I said I certainly would like to speak to her, so she got her on the phone. And there's where we renewed acquaintances. And needless to say, I tried to get in touch with her as soon as I could. So the next bus to Boise, I headed for Thatcher Street. And I've often thought, what if that first weekend I had been in Boise, I had met her in the street with this other guy. But anyway, as things worked out, one date, another date, and pretty quick we decided I was going to be there probably 7 or 8 more weeks. So apparently that's where our romance really blossomed, and we got engaged in Boise. I remember in a city park where there was a irrigation canal. There was some nice evergreens around, and that was a setting for our getting engaged. And for some reason or other, she decided on selecting me, thank God. And she stayed there another week or two, and then went on to San Francisco, or somewhere there in that area, to visit her friend. And we were engaged, and I hadn't met her parents, and she hadn't met mine. But anyway, it worked out. You want to cut? I was assigned to Italy, but I could only write censored mail for contact with her. And I was in Venosa in southeastern Italy until, I was there from late December, early January of 1944. until May of 1945. And all I could do was write letters and not say much because of censorship. But anyway, in May of 45, I was reassigned to the United States. Didn't know where. We thought to go to the Pacific, but it ended up that when I got to Camp Kilburn, New Jersey, I was able to call Carola and tell her when I would meet her in Minneapolis in late May of 1945, and I met her at the old Great Northern Railroad depot, which is now the site of the Federal Reserve Bank in Minnesota. And we got on the bus. We had a few days until we had set up arrangements for the wedding at Easton, and I still hadn't met her mother and dad, but I was a good friend of Mrs. Loud, who had a boys' rooming house at the university. So I stayed at the house, and Carola stayed with Mrs. Loud, or the girls next door, I forget which. But anyway, we were around Minneapolis for about a week, a little less than that, maybe 4 or 5 days. And we bought our wedding ring at Willis Jewelers and got on the Greyhound bus and drove down about 100 miles down to Winnebago, where a friend of Carola's, a girlfriend, picked us up and drove us about 10 miles east to Easton. And I had never met Tom or Anna Lonan until I got to Easton. And I have always said that I didn't want to break my arm patting myself on the back, but I must have made a favorable first impression, because when we got to the house in Easton, they gave me the circular bedroom on the second floor, and so we made arrangements for the wedding at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church, and then a few days later we got married and took the bus back to Minneapolis, and stayed at the hotel for a couple of nights until we made arrangements to fly out to travel out to upstate New York, where I had grown up. I had kind of researched schools in the East, but at that time the college system was such that going to college to the East meant going to mostly private schools, and there the tuition was tremendous compared to what it was in the land-grant colleges in the Midwest, like Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, where the government helped fund students to encourage spread of education in the Midwest. And that's why the name came to land-grant colleges. And to this day, several of them are known by that name. But in upstate New York, uh, like, there were very few small like state-operated schools. They were mostly like Carleton and St. Olaf and high-priced private schools. So I searched the West, and one of my brother-in-laws eventually told me, he said, "Joe," he said, "I think why you came west is Minnesota had a good football team, and you were interested in athletics, so you." And my dad had been through Minnesota in his earlier days, so anyway, I took a chance. When I got to Minneapolis, I had a list of boys' rooming schools, or rooming houses. So I found one at Mrs. Loudon's house, just a block from the university, and I stayed there. And then when I came back from overseas in May of '45, went down east and got married, came back to Minnesota, and we stayed in that same area of Minneapolis where I still live today, and raised our family in southeast Minneapolis. And all of our kids grew up here. Most of them went to the university, and we stayed in southeast because even though the job took me in the suburbs, we decided that if our kids had the desire to go beyond high school, here we're living right by the university, so most of them went to the university and graduated from there. So we grew up right here in southeast and have stayed here, and the kids have spread hither and yon around the world.
So when did you decide to go into the service, and why did you decide to go into the service?
Well, I was in upstate New York, and I had to sign up for the service.
You had to?
Right, and mandatory. I think it was 18th. Anyway, so I signed up, and after my first year, when I got out here to Minnesota, I found out that they had an operation, the Air Force had an operation set up at the university where you could get in an Air Corps Reserve and get out of the draft, which I had originally signed up for. So I had really wanted to fly, and I just add a tidbit there. My interest in flying aroused primarily from the fact that my folks lived on a farm a couple miles from this town of Messina, and there was a big pasture in the back of the farm. The cows kept the grass pretty well chewed down, and there were at that time there were pilots that were called barnstormers, and apparently the word got around that if you were going to be up in that part of town on the summer weekends, you'd find a landing field and rent some space for maybe 2 or 3 weekends, and then my dad would rent the space to these barnstorming pilots, and they also make part of the deal that the pilots would give their kids, there were 4 of us in the family, give us 3 kids and their parents a couple rides in the airplane, at that time, that was 1930s, early 30s. That was really an event. So I kind of got hooked on flying.
How old were you when you would fly with the Barnstormers?
Let's see, I was born in 21, about 10.
Oh, yeah.
And then I was still interested in the aviation, and incidentally, we lived right on the banks of the St. Lawrence River, and on the other side, there was an island in the middle of the river. Then the other side of it, the St. Lawrence River, was Canada. And the dirigibles, the R-100 and the R-101, German lighter than aircraft, would fly. So that really kept up my interest in flying. And then I stayed in that Air Corps Reserve, and then went into I got out of the draft service by joining the Air Corps Reserve. So then in February of 1943, I was called into service, active service from the reserve. And I remember leaving the old Milwaukee Railroad station in Minneapolis and going to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, and learned how to march. And then from there, I went to various places around the country. And amongst them was Chickasha, Oklahoma, and San Antonio. I was in San Antonio 2 or 3 times, and I finally graduated from advanced flight training in Brooks Field in San Antonio. And from there, I had got married at Easton while I was in the June 16th, 1945, and then was assigned as an instructor in Frederick, Oklahoma, and that was a short-lived experience. And then I volunteered to be a co-pilot on the B-24 4-engine bomber, and was assigned to different spots. I ended up at Mountain Home, Idaho, and that's one of the turns in my life, in the life of our kids, really. And I was assigned to be a co-pilot on the 24th at Mountain Home, Idaho, and unbeknowingly, almost next door to Carola. So then I went to Italy, and Carola left Boise, Idaho, and went to California to visit her girlfriend, which was her original intent, but that's how the world worked in those days. You were coming and going and didn't know always where or when or with whom. So I had God's blessings that things worked out like they did. And I went to Italy. I was out of the United States exactly 6 months. And then the war in Europe ended, and we were assigned back to the United States. And that's when I got back to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey on May 20th of 45. Then I could write and tell Carola when I was coming back. So
where were you when you learned the war had ended?
When I went where?
Where were you when you learned the war was over? Do you remember?
I was in Naples, Italy, waiting for a boat back to the United States. The war in Europe had ended, and we were confined to the base. Stayed right on.
Grandpa, with your hand, you're covering up the microphone. Sorry to interrupt.
Right.
You were in Naples?
We were in Naples, and we were there for a week or less, and then they were assigned to the United States. Incidentally, on our way from the United States to Italy, we spent 20 days on this cruise of the South Atlantic in a flotilla of about 60 Liberty ships. And we landed in Oran, North Africa. And we're there for 10 days, just waiting for orders for our next move. And then we got orders to move to Venosa, Venosa, in southeast Italy. And then the experience in the Army or the Air Force was that before you flew a combat mission, you had to fly with an experienced crew. And the weather was so bad in December, January, and February that I got delayed, and I was the last guy in our flight of 11 crew members to get to fly with an experienced crew. And my first mission was to a submarine base in the northern Adriatic Sea. Well, then after that, we flew with our regular crews. And most of our missions were over Austria and Yugoslavia. My longest mission was to Prague, Czechoslovakia. A little sideline, after so many missions you flew, they'd give you a rest and recuperation leave. And that could be anywhere in Allied territory, usually a week to 10 days. And it so happened that that my rest and recuperation leave was at the Isle of Capri. And currently you read about the Isle of Capri, and it tells about one of the fanciest hotels in Europe was the Hotel Quisisano. And we spent about a week there. And I can remember going on a ferry boat from Naples to Capri. And then when we got to Capri, the 4 officers stayed forward to a stateroom, and the enlisted men stayed down in the hold with the rest of the. That's incidentally is where I first learned I guess you'd call it the European caste system, because the enlisted men were down in the hole and the officers were in the officers' quarters. So when we got there, we were going to be sleeping in army tents and army cots in army tents in the flight stations, which was Venosa. So we went from there to super first class beds and inner spring mattresses and just the luxury.
Yeah.
So that was a real change of pace. And that was in the late winter of 1945. And then on May 20th of 45, we were back in Gilmer, New Jersey. And then we found out that our next stop was Miami Beach, Florida. So I like to say that I was the last of the big spenders and took my new bride wife to Miami Beach in June and July, on a honeymoon. And I thought Carola was getting her first real taste of real Army life, moving from base to base. But unexpectedly, walking down the street in Miami one day, because we could go out of the.
Can you move your hand? There you go. Thanks.
We would go down the hall, right out onto Miami Beach, and that was not the typical Army life. But
What was that like?
what's that?
What was that like? Not the typical Army life?
No, staying on the Miami Beach fancy hotel
Nice.
with the beach, and the Army supplied top line food, and just everything was like. So we're walking down the street this one day in Miami Beach, and I met a guy, Bob Boygan from Detroit, and he said, "Oh, hi Joe, how are you? How many points do you have?" "Well, I don't know." So he started, "Did you do this? You got that? You got this? Hey, you got 34 points. You're out." So I found out. I said, "I'll believe it when I hear it officially." So the next day we found out that yes, we were going to be sent to Jacksonville, Florida for reassignment. And they got to Jacksonville 10 o'clock at night and got a place through the Salvation Army to stay because all the hotels were full. Excuse me.
Bless you.
And then in about 3 days, Carola and I were headed back to Minneapolis as civilians, decommissioned from the Air Corps.
Congratulations.
One incident I'd like to always remember. I was so blessed, I look back at it now, that on February 23rd, 1945, we were on a flight mission bombing a place in Austria, and the weather wasn't right for bombing at the first initial target, so we went to the second target, which was an alternate at Bruck, B-R-U-X, Austria. And I had an experience that I just never forgot. We were flying at a number 5 spot right off the wing, just less than 100 feet off the wing of another plane that had some guys in it that we knew. And their plane was hit by at least one anti-aircraft bomb, which killed the navigator and the bombardier, and severely wounded the pilot. And the co-pilot was not assigned to that crew as a regular, but when he saw the pilot slump over the controls, he reached over and pulled him off the controls so the co-pilot could take control. And we were in plain sight of watching this plane. It had got hit by a second shell that had pierced the plane fuselage, and it set the plane on fire. And my summation was that the fire, the the shell did not explode because right through the roof of the plane, you could see where the shell had gone through, had pierced the plane, but had not exploded. But it must have broke the fuel lines and sprayed the inside of the plane, because we watched the plane burn in two, and then it, as it faded from view, it went down under the head of us. It burned in two in the front, the wing and the four engines, and the pilot's compartment just burned in two and tumbled to the ground, and the rest of it, the tail part of it, just slowly spun and into the ground. Well, for we didn't know what all happened to the crew. We saw 6 or 7 guys try to parachute out, and one of those was the guy from the radio man from our crew, who was taken as a equipment specialist to fly on a certain spot that day. He was on that plane. Well, anyway, we didn't hear from any of them for weeks, about 3 weeks. Then I got a letter from him, and he was at Camp Lucky Strike, a place in France where U.S. and British troops who had escaped or were funneled into the underground, they were sent there. So then I found out some more about the plane, but maybe 40 years later, at a reunion, we stayed with Patty and Richard in Washington. I met some guys that were on board that plane and had parachuted, and I met the co-pilot who survived the crash and knew what happened. So I found out from him and another one of those guys who had parachuted out that that the pilot who had been injured and apparently rode the plane right into the ground, he was in the hospital, and this co-pilot was injured, and he was in the hospital, and the guard, German or Austrian guard at the time, said, "What are these?" And he showed him dog tags, which were all looked at him, and they were the name of Bob Ware, who was the pilot who had been severely injured. And anyway, this hospital guard said, "Would you like to?" He said, "What are these?" The guy told him. He said, "Would you like to see them?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Follow me." So he took him down the hall and did a room, pulled back a sheet. There was the guy's body. He had apparently been injured severely and died. And just a little follow-up to that, how the war went. About 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, Patty, her daughter, was out here, and she, through her genealogy charts and charting and so forth, had made contact with the nephew of that pilot who had been killed. And I was upstairs on the phone talking to the nephew of that guy that was killed for an hour. So, and he's buried in West Virginia somewhere. But I just throw that in as the way things worked out. So.
Is that the most, when were you the most scared when you were overseas? Did you ever feel for your life?
18 times. And I say that because I went on 18 missions. And when you're up there and you know you're like a duck during hunting season, you're either a liar or you're not telling the truth. I'm not telling you who won World War II, but
Yeah, tell us who won World War II.
but just as I recall it, and I say blessed because on that flight, that mission, the plane that was hit, or the pilot, bombardier, and navigator were killed, and that had some special radar jamming equipment called Panther, and our radio man, Merle Shields from California, was really schooled in that. They wanted, I think, I was blessed because why did they take our crew with this guy and fly them in that position? And they did. Second thing was I was scheduled to fly that day, and we were flying in the number 5 slot, I believe it was. And if I hadn't been scheduled to fly, I would have been in the place of this copilot, who I met 40 years later, and he explained to me what happened to some of the guys. And then I've been another guy from that same crew. So I could have been not scheduled to fly and been assigned to that, and who knows what could happen. So that was just the luck of the draw, I guess.
Yeah.
So anything else you could?
Those are all my questions. Do you have any questions?
Can you kind of talk a little bit about just kind of generally about where all of your kids wound up, and like,
Yeah.
what you and Carola were most proud of with your family?
Well, one of the things we're most proud of is the fact that the kids and their offspring have turned out as they have. And it was so important that they've communicated. They've kept that up. And Carola was always, I would say, an international-minded individual, interested in what was going on in Easton and what was going on in Paris, or around the world. And I think we, I don't know just how to say it, but we did think we tried our best to get the best from our kids, to have them communicating with each other and being aware of what the world was really like. And to this day, I believe without exception, the kids all say that they're glad they grew up in southeast Minneapolis because of the international character of the neighborhood. They had friends from all different countries of the world, just right in the immediate neighborhood. They were their friends. So they got to know what the real world was like. And to this day, occasionally we're driving into southeast from up north or somewhere, and just say, well, now you're back in the inner city. And they said, yeah, Daddy, but we're sure glad we grew up here, because this is the real world. And from this has sprung what we just had here, and we still have the International House with 15 or 16 people from Norway and Japan and Korea and China. Our grandkids are just scattered around the world. And I think of it now where we have the grandsons from China, and the Norwegians, the kids that are 3 and 4 years old are going to be growing up together. That this is the real world, and we like to think that the way circumstances worked out, that God's good graces has been with us, been good to the family, and we've been blessed.
One more question, Grandpa. What's the meaning of life?
What's the meaning of life? Use your God-given and inherited characteristics to the best of your ability so that you can use your talents as best you can for the good of humanity. And we're just proud of every one of you. You've taken different paths in the world, and we like to feel that we've been a little contribution, and it has been good for you, good for the humanity, good for the people you grew up with. So
Cool. Anything else you want to talk about? Any other stories you're dying to tell?
My what?
Any other stories that you really want to tell that we didn't think to ask you about?
No, well, first off, I can go back to a little about my background, and really it is a reflection of what has happened to me and to Carola and to the family and to you, your offspring. That my parents were French Canadian, and my dad had a lot of Scotch, and my mother's parents were basically solid French Canadians, and you have a lot of relatives in Canada now. And my dad, when he was about 18 and 20, had a friend back in eastern Canada who had an uncle in North Dakota. So they conspired to go visit the uncle in North Dakota, and Dad was around Alberta and Saskatchewan. And in the summer he worked in the wheat fields, in the winter he worked in the woods. And he said, at that time, Canada, as did the U.S. later, had a land grant deal. And if you applied for a land grant from the government and got it, fortunate it didn't draw, if you would break, I think it was they'd get a grant for 10 or 20 acres on the condition that if they lived on it for a certain number of years and they broke up the prairie land and planted wheat and grains, they could become owners of the land. And then after a few years they could apply for another grant. And some of those people really did well and ended up with 1,000 acres of land, and, big stakes. But Dad said that he used to tell us how his brother, Henry, who lived back near Cornwall, Ontario, wrote to him and said to Angus, my dad, why don't you come back? We need you on the farm. So he said after a few letters, he decided to go back. And he had applied for and had received a grant for land. So I look at it, and he stayed there. He well could have ended up with a sizable piece of land. In fact, he told me about several years later, he was back in Eastern Canada, and a guy stopped to visit him who he had worked for in the summer back in Saskatchewan. And the guy had gone back to Sweden and got married, came back, and so when you look at it as a situation where if Dad had pursued his possible grants, he could have ended up in the West and would have been a whole different story. Okay, anything else, Mark?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. It's my privilege to be able to have lived through it.
I know.
Yeah, and, with Carola, it was incomparable.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy that you have Carola Ann Loonan's genes.
Me too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.